Freedom Day 2023. How far so far? What are the high points of Nigeria's media and what are those low points? What are the challenges that have had to be encountered? And please, what's there to be done? Let's have this conversation, as you have seen there, with Lanre Arugundade, Executive Director, International Press Center. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Mark, my colleague earlier, when we began the conversation, referenced the, should I say the famous or infamous 1993 elections that produced the longest, what I would call the longest session of activism in our democratic process. It was against the military, it wasn't within a democracy, and it lasted 5 years, 1993 to 1998, when the activities around having a fourth republic began. Can you give us a quick recap of that time and how significant it was for the press to have taken that on with CSOs?
Well, I would say very, very significant. Incidentally, today we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of the World Press Freedom Day. So actually, World Press Freedom Day came into existence in that same 1993.
But a month before the election.
A month before the elections. And the origin itself was in Africa, because in 1991, there was a global media conference in Windhoek, Namibia, where there was a declaration. It's popularly called the Windhoek Declaration on an independent and pluralistic African press. From that declaration, UNESCO and the United Nations later said, let's have a global celebration of World Press Freedom Day. So in a sense, without knowing it, we were actually celebrating, press freedom when, we were fighting, the military. And what really happened, really, was that the media collectively and through its organizations put itself at the vanguard of that, struggle, because the media was the only organization that could do that. Of course, we have the pro-democracy organizations, the human rights groups, the trade unions, everybody fighting, going on strike. But the media was a vehicle of expression
for everyone.
And it's quite symbolic, because if you look at the theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day, it talks about shaping a future of rights, freedom of expression as driver of all other human rights. So in 1993, we saw how the press, as the vehicle of freedom of expression, became the driver of the struggle against the military, in Nigeria, and it came with enormous prices. You talked about 1993 to 1998. Within that period, many journalists ran into exile, and sometimes people like us are pained that when we celebrate the heroes of democracy, we don't really celebrate, the media. And even when we celebrate the media, we celebrate those who were jailed, those who were in detention, which is correct, but there were many others who paid prices. Let me give you this example. I was working in National Concord during this period. I was features editor. Sikakesian was our editor. The National Concord was shut down twice. The first time, the military said they were looking for ammunition in our premises, and then they reopened us. But the second time, they shut National Concord, and hundreds of journalists lost their jobs, particularly because M.K. Abiola later died in detention. Punch newspapers was also shut down, The Guardian. So we have so many journalists that paid prices that, in fact, if we were to publish a book on that moment, it will run into volumes. But the good thing, and I guess the point you are trying to make, is that if we look back 1993 and now, what we should be celebrating is the fact that without the media, we won't have this democracy. Journalists were taken before military tribunals, tried for being accessories after the fact of a coup, simply because they helped, to provide information. Things were going on in the military, and you had courageous journalists from the News Temple then, the Tell magazine, and a number of them. And they were taking, it's really, I don't think it has happened in any part of the world where journalists will be taken before a military tribunal, and the implication. You could be sentenced to death invariably, they were given life sentences, the likes of, Kunle Ajibade and the rest of them. Our families were affected. You see, in the desperation to get at some journalists, the security agents decided that if we don't get the people we want, we will pick their relatives. So I recall, for example, that Dakpolo Yomi's wife had a 3-month-old baby then. And then they came for him, they didn't get him, and then they decided to arrest the wife with the kid. There was one Bumi Aborishade who was publishing a magazine called June 12 magazine. The wife was heavily pregnant. Then they came for him, he ran away, he had to go into exile and abandoned, the poor, woman, here in Nigeria. I think that those children now should also be happy, and they will be shocked that so while we were kids, all these kind of things, were happening to us. We had a person like Soji Omotunde, who was abducted in broad daylight. I mean, it was when they be looking for him, and they grabbed him and subjected him to all kind of inhuman treatments. We had Nero Molalu, for example, too, who spent years in detention because they said, he knew about a coup and whatever. And there were several others, as you have. There were several others. Publisher of. So I think that publisher of Razor magazine. The publisher of Razor magazine said to have Moshood Fayemiwo. Yeah. In his own case, we didn't even know his whereabouts. He had suddenly disappeared. And when Bumi Aborishade was now detained and taken to, at that time, journalists were being taken to underground cell at the DMI in Apapa. That was where, and then when they threw him there, it's already discovered that there was Moshood Fayemiwo, manacled. His hands were, he was made standing, and then his hands were tied up like this, and then his legs were in chains. It was just something that you couldn't. Isn't it ironic at that time, Mr. believe? At that time, the World Press Freedom Day started in the very same year that press freedom was shackled. Exactly. In fact, it was like I was saying the military then was trying to say this press freedom does not have anything to do with us. Is that to say that it wasn't communicated, or whatever it was that Nigeria signed up to was signed up to without recourse to the authorities, or I don't know. What do you make of that? Well, we were under the military anyway, and the military didn't necessarily believe in press freedom. As a matter of fact, it had been a running battle up to that point. You see, when the then General Muhammad Buhari, for example, took over the reins of power in the coup of 1983, and he was interviewed. And I remember that interview with the Punch newspapers. And what he said was that I will tamper with the press. That was the language he used. Well, he was a military leader. Then he said, I will tamper with the press. And they did, because we had Decree 4 of 1984, which made it an offense for a news medium to publish the truth if the truth was not approved by the Supreme Military Council. That was how Nduka Irabo and Tunde Thompson were clamped into jail. So for the military, we knew that there was a press freedom celebration already at the level of the Nigerian Union of Journalists, for example, at the level of other organizations, of the media. But it was just that the military didn't bother to be concerned, really. Okay. But like I said, what we did was to take a historical, decision to assist Nigerian people, because we realized that everybody was suffering under the military. The rights didn't, exist. And it was the media that could really, fight, for those rights, including the rights of even military men themselves. Okay. And that was how they really saw the media, as a threat, and they felt, we had to do something about the media. But the good thing was that, in spite of all those, repression, the courage that the media in Nigeria demonstrated was something that was almost unbelievable. Because everything you were doing was at a risk. Even then, we were in the leadership at some time of the Nigerian Union of Journalists in Lagos State. A majority of the journalists affected were from the Lagos State Council. So we couldn't keep quiet. We were issuing statements. We were reaching out to international media organizations, and they responded very well. The likes of Chris Anyanwu, who now became a senator, a woman, was among those who were taken, before the military and put in detention indefinitely.
And it's a good time. It's a good time to take stock. If you look down 30 years down the line, when we are now talking about the dividends of democracy, when we have, that big symbol of democracy, the National Assembly, without which many would say that we do not have a democracy. Would you say that the Nigerian press, being forged in the furnace of affliction, paying, most of the time the ultimate price for where we are today, does the Nigerian press have the pride of place that it deserves, as having sacrificed ultimately for this democracy?
Well, I don't think, we are occupying that pride of place that you described. And one worrisome trend is that if you also look at the trajectory of our development, some of who fought for this press freedom, get into government and begin to negate those same things, that we fought for. It's really a matter, of irony. And if you look at civilian, democracy, for example, we're documenting, rather unfortunately, many more attacks than what we witnessed in the military. The military situation was quite bizarre, so they could take you before military tribunal. But how do you explain that we're in a democracy, we have some of those who fought for this democracy as journalists, as leaders of media organizations, working with governments, as special advisors on media and so on, and they tend to justify the curtailment, of press freedom, which for me should not be the case. In 2022, just at the level of the International Press Center alone, we documented 66 attacks on journalists and the media. And that does not mean that captured everything, that happened, because sometimes some journalists are too afraid to talk about the threats that they face. And that was much more than what was witnessed in 2021. Or look at the last elections, for example. Although the good thing is we didn't have as many attacks as we had in 2019, but at least up to about 20 journalists were still harassed, in the course of duty. So for me, we have not really made that kind of progress that should reflect the fact that we're in a democracy. I recall your earlier discussion. You talked about the fact that press freedom goes with responsibilities. And I'm sure there are listeners out there who would say, well, the media, too, you have your excesses. I know we've faced some criticism during the last elections, and some of our colleagues were accused.
We'll come to that.
Okay.
We'll come to that definitely, because, there are gaps to fill. But, going back to the issue that Bukola raised and the response you gave, let's speak about the political space itself. And you have rightly identified two categories of spaces in which mostly journalists occupy. One, we have journalists like Chris Anyanwu, you mentioned, Smart Adeyemi, Abike Dabiri, all in government now. Exactly. And quite a number of others in houses of assembly and National Assembly and the rest of them who were journalists or who are still journalists.
Yeah,
and one way or the other,
always a journalist.
Exactly, one way or the other, they find themselves in government now. That's one space. The other space is the appointment of speakers, or rather spokespersons to the authorities, chief press secretaries, information officers at the local
commissioners,
information officers at the local government level, information commissioners, all journalists across the board. So one wonders then, what, in your opinion, changes? Because the expectation, we have taken issues up here about collapsed buildings, and we know that engineers, we have engineers in federal, state, and local governments, ministries of works and related agencies of government like that. We have lawyers at government levels, and we still have some things happening that we're wondering, isn't this judicial anymore? So do we have journalists flooring the entire space of government at all levels? Yet we have these issues that you are raising about press, gagging of press freedom and the rest of them. What do you think is missing? Is it the ethics that are missing, or something they get new information that they did not get when they were on the outside?
So I think what is missing, or is it what is missing? What changes, like you said, is the fact that when they go into government, and even me, if I go to government tomorrow, you're dealing with a different ethics. The ethics of the profession is about access to information. It's about professionalism. It's about the fact that give the other side equal opportunity. For example, during campaigns, we talk about the fact that the media should give equitable access to political parties and candidates. But the ethics of politicians is different. Their own ethics is an ethics of news that is continuously favorable to them. News that is not critical of their conduct. Their ethics that frowns at investigative journalism that exposes corruption. So when you as a journalist now becomes a spokesperson for a politician that ad initio does not believe in press freedom, your duty is to ensure that all news that come out are favorable.
I'm at a loss.
You're at a loss.
Just a second. Let me ask you. I understand what you're saying.
So what I'm saying is that
I understand, but let me raise this. You said that their ethics change when they get into these offices, and that's a problem, in my opinion. Here is why. The doctor's ethics don't change, whichever hospital he gets to. The lawyer's ethics don't change. They may try to change it, but it doesn't change. The ethics of an accountant doesn't change. The engineer's ethics doesn't change, because if you misuse, if you miscalculate certain things in the equipment or materials, the house will come down, whether it's a federal house or local or private house. So, why does the ethic of the journalist change?
The ethics. I'm not justifying. The ethics shouldn't change. A journalist, even if you are in government, should strive to fight for press freedom. And in some instances, some of them had actually done that. If you look at the history of the Freedom of Information Act, for example, a number of them, contributed. Abike Dabiri, for example, was one of the original sponsors, of the bill. So there are instances where, as journalists, they've played one role. But what I'm telling you is the fact that you are a journalist, but you are also working with a politician that does not believe in access to information. The moment you subscribe to that, you are treading a very dangerous ground. Now, for the other professions that you mentioned, they also have organizations, powerful organizations that could discipline you on the basis of the work you do. Do we have that in the media? And then, can we actually say that the work they do is journalistic work, to the extent that you now say, by your conduct, you violated the code and we could sanction you? What the media can do and what the media organization should be doing is to say that, as Nigerian Guild of Editors, as Nigerian Union of Journalists, you have been a member. So if you are now in government and you support unlawful arrest and detention of journalists, and you take all those steps, those organizations could have a black book.
But
they could have a hall of shame. Because I'm just saying that, you see, what they do really when they are in government, we must understand that it's no longer journalism. At best, PR, because and it's quite unfortunate. It's quite ironic. And so for me, what we need to look at is how we can have very, very strong professional body that can come out and say, on the basis of your conduct, we are no longer, or for example, we have people that will make fellows of Nigerian Guild of Editors. So if somebody is a fellow of the guild, and the guild had its own ethics, and you go into government, and your government is clamping journalists to detention, and you are defending that, we need a guild of editors that would say, we're withdrawing your fellowship.
I'm still conflicted there, Mr. Arugundade.
Why are you conflicted?
Because that's just one aspect of the job. In extreme cases, when you cross over to that other side, there are ethics of confidentiality. In extreme cases, there are ethics of secrecy.
Sure.
So I've had colleagues, senior colleagues, who have said, I got several offers, to become a spokesperson, and I turned them down. So shouldn't we begin to say that once they cross over to the other side, some of them call it call to service, and that's the justification for accepting the offer. So shouldn't we begin to say that once they cross over to the other side and begin to work in the corridors of power, that they are no longer journalists?
Exactly. So we should limit our expectations. That's what I'm saying. That's the point. Because you still assume that these people, are journalists. They will say they are journalists. They remain journalists. But the truth of the matter is that the work that they do, in most instances, is actually antithetical to what journalism should be all about.
Essentially, we can say then.
So for me, we limit exactly. So we should limit our expectations, because they are doing the opposite of what they should be. Okay. When, as an editor, now as we are here, all we're trying to do is, get information, do everything. When they are there, Their job is really, it's a different form of gatekeeping.
They become the source that they were looking for.
But exactly,
there are some issues. There are some issues. My apologies, because we're really running out of time. There are some issues that you wanted to go to the other time. What are the gaps within the Nigerian media space, print, electronic, and now online? That's completely liberalized now, that need to be filled, and how?
I think we need to fill the ethical and professional gaps. And I'm glad you mentioned the fact that you have the online space, which has kind of disrupted, the old process of news production. Because in those days, you really have gatekeepers in the newsrooms, in the sense that a reporter goes out of the field, brings a story, and you give the story to a sub-editor or somebody in the newsroom who goes through, raises questions and so on. Now, because of the advent of the internet, because everybody wants to break the news, you are in a hurry. Stories just go out, fly there directly without the proper checks that should happen. That for me is a gap that should be filled, really, in terms of how we do our work. That in itself is a major gap, and we really have to find that space. See, I try to say this all the time. Don't be in a rush to break a news that will cause a problem, because indeed we don't really have breaking news anymore. When you think it's a broken news, I mean, the breaking news is already broken. Yeah,
Mr. Agunade, 30 seconds to respond to this one. Some of the issues that you have raised just now is as a result of the welfare of journalists.
Yeah.
That's a gap, isn't it?
It's a gap. In fact, welfare itself is a press freedom issue. So when we talk about World Press Freedom Day, the threat to press freedom is not just all these incidents of arrest and so on. Poor welfare, poor resources is also a threat. Okay. And we need to have conversations around that. The economic survival of the media, the survival of the journalists themselves, who needs to be well-resourced, well-protected, given insurance when going to cover dangerous assignments, so that at the end of the day, you are not at the whims of and caprice of those that you are trying, to cover. As we see during the political processes, where the candidates that you are covering are the ones providing for your needs, for your movement. It does not augur well. It's a gap that needs to be filled.
I think, let me assume that it's one of those...
protecting them during the attacks as well. If we recall, some of our colleagues...
We really have to go, Bukola. Lanle Arundade, Executive Director, International Press Center. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Truly appreciate the time.
Bukola.
Well, there are so many issues that you may have also brought in on the program today, and guess what? I guess that's about the much we can take, isn't it?
We're totally out of time. We'll not be able to take your mails today, but we will surely do that tomorrow. I want to thank you very much for being on, for allowing us share your morning on this World Press Freedom Day. Thank you for watching. I am Bukola Koka.
I'm Ayo Makinde. Have a wonderful day.
Well, the passionate Ayo takes the blame for all of that. Thank you so much for watching this morning. I'm Malkwe Yusuf.
Indeed, Ayo was just expressing his freedom, just like we all. But in the midst of expressing your freedom, there is responsibility. Do ensure that you're responsible. I'm Neo Taigbe. Thank you for watching.